right, good morning, man. So the production crew asked me this morning if they wanted me to, or they wanted to have the stool up here. They said, if you get tired, you need to sit down. I said, well, unfortunately, if you ask my wife, I don't stand still very well. But I have a confession to make. So this week has been pretty challenging for me. And so I needed to live the message that I want to share with you today as much as any of us did. Right now, professionally, it's been a very challenging time. As you can imagine, I've got a lot going on. We have an 8 and 10-year-old kids, as I mentioned before, very active in events. And earlier this week, actually over this weekend, my wife traveled down to Florida to help her best friend who had a property affected by the hurricane. So I've been doing the single parent thing here for the last 5 days. And so it's been a little challenging. But that doesn't mean that these kind of days and these kind of events aren't still important. And I would encourage you, we're all busy, right? But make time. Seek Him. Seek His wisdom. So the good news, we're over halfway done. The bad news, well, you guys have already figured out I have no idea what I'm talking about. Again, my wife can attest. All right? But, we start off this series talking about competition. The fact that we are predispositioned to compete. And that comes from our sinful nature. We have the innate desire to achieve significance or comfort or control, which you may recognize from the 33 series for those who have taken it, over other people, over the situation. That's our natural disposition, right? We have to seek intentionally to find opportunities to serve. Right? The second week we talked about purpose, direction, and motivation, right? Well, how does the Army define leadership? Right? We talked about the fact that we are wired by God to follow, right? We crave leadership, right? We talked about some of the world events, that I've been fortunate to be part of. But again, we crave leadership. We crave followership. Last week we talked about identity and what is a leader identity, right? We talked about the be, know, do, the attributes, the competencies that come with being a leader. But then we talked about our identity is really about our mortality. And when you come to terms with your own, I'm not sure what that was, but when you come to terms with your own morality and the morality of those that you love, it changes your priorities. It changes your perspective. And we're going to talk a little more about that today. Today we're going to talk about leadership development, right? And then we're going to talk next week, we're going to wrap it up about how do we lead ourselves and lead others to Jesus. Okay. Now, I'm sure everybody woke up this morning, got here extra early so they could hear a little bit more about leadership development. That's supposed to be a joke. Because I recognize that leadership development is a topic, is a buzzword, is something that almost all of us have had exposure to. It's something that we've all had a presentation on, said it was really important, right? But what is it all about? Right? What does it mean to develop leaders? Are leaders born? Are leaders made? I'll tell you, the Army absolutely believes that leaders are made. And I believe that Jesus also believes the leaders are made. We talked a little bit last time about, attributes and competencies, right? So attributes, things that we can train you, right? So in the Army, I could train you to shoot a machine gun, right? That's an attribute. How you employ that machine gun in a firefight in a hostile environment, that competency, it's only developed through experience. Okay? So you have to have the skill set. You have to know the good word. You have to know what Jesus taught. But you have to apply it in your life. Right? That's the only way that this actually works. How do we transcend from knowledge to wisdom? Right? How do we get that opportunity to share the good news? So this is how the Army says we develop leaders. All right, we're going to talk about these different domains. Right? And so, again, the Army says leadership, it's a continuous, progressive process by which the synthesis of individual training, education, and experience contribute to an individual's growth over the course of their life. Right? So we're going to break these down, but it's a continuous process. It's a progressive process, meaning that you start wherever you start your faith walk, right? Whether that started as a child or whether that started as an adult, wherever you started that faith walk, right? That's a progression. It's a continuous effort. And it's not always in the right direction. None of us are perfect. But I hope, I pray that it's always moving towards Him. Okay? So again, leadership, it's a mutually shared responsibility across these three domains. Okay? And you can see that there's components of leadership development in each one of these domains, but they're in different priorities. The first one for the Army is the operational domain, right? This is where we operate. It's where we compete. Okay? This is where, for most of us, right, we spend the vast majority of our lives. This is the world we live in. The Army says, we compete in the air, the land, the sea, space, cyber. Where do we compete? What are the domains, the operational domains that we live in? Right? We have institutional domains. So the Army invests in its leaders. By the way, it considers every soldier a leader. Right? We spend resources, time, energy, intentionality in developing leaders. Right? And we do this part, right? This is the formal education. Right? We teach you how to do the things that we expect you to do. And the church is no different. Now, the Army, it's not exactly a polite suggestion. You will do these things. You will go through the training. But in the church, it's a little different, right? We have choices. And then the last one is the self-development domain. right? And there's three components to this, right? There's for the Army, there's a structured self-development. So every year I have to develop my own individual development plan. What are the things that I'm going to do as a leader to continue to develop myself? Right? It's a requirement. It's part of the job. We also have kind of guided self-development, right? These are recommendations, right? These are opportunities for us to continue to develop ourselves, right? And then you have personal development, right? And that might be something like physical fitness, taking up a new hobby, pursuing college education outside of the military education. And they've talked a lot about why does self-development matter? And I'll tell you that there is an enormous amount of research out there that says that the people that continue to self-develop in whatever place in life they are, in whatever pursuit that they're in, the more able to adapt to change, the more resilient in the face of challenges. They typically perform better in their professional responsibilities. They exhibit, critical thinking skills, increased confidence in problem solving. They actively share knowledge with their network. They show stronger emotional commitment. They experience deeper learning right now than just surface understanding. And ultimately, they find their lives more meaningful. So I would challenge you to say, if you're not thinking about self-development, regardless of your place in life, you're missing an opportunity. But so what? So what? So what does all this leadership matter? And why does it matter to a Christian who's following Jesus? I would offer that leadership development gives you perspective. You're like, okay, Eric, what's that mean? What's perspective mean? To me, perspective is wisdom applied to experience. Now, all of us are gaining experience every day, which, by the way, every day is a gift. Everybody gains experience. I talked about last week previously about mortality, right, and our identity. And you've heard the saying before, right? Life is short. Which, by the way, I think is hogwash. Life is finite. Life is finite. But statistically speaking, we're all blessed to live in America. Average life expectancy for a man is 76 years old. That's a lot of days. That's a lot of opportunities. So again, leadership development gives you perspective. But perspective, again, is a combination of two things. It's experience, but it's wisdom. So if you remember from, my first speech, I talked a little bit about my experience at the War College last year. And the motto of the Army War College is strength and wisdom. For Christians, I would say it's strength through wisdom. Our strength comes from God's wisdom. That strengthens our faith in ourselves, in others, and it influences our perspective on the world. And again, Jesus is that source of our wisdom. God is a source of our wisdom. And He's willing to give it to us if we're willing to ask. So if we're a leader for Jesus, leading others to Jesus, how do we develop that wisdom? So I would argue, first of all, it's humility. You know, Tim shared with me a story about Norman Schwarzkopf this morning, right, about a story from his leadership during Vietnam. And we read his autobiography, man of great character, great integrity, but not perfect. And he'll be the first to tell you that. And he did in his autobiography. But he was in the situation that they were talking about during Vietnam, he was humble. Just like Jesus calls us to be. So how many of you think this is maybe uncomfortable for some of you, but how many think that your best days are behind you? It's a loaded question. I agree. And you're probably guessing where I'm going with this. I would argue if our goal is wisdom, our goal is perspective, we are more valuable to God, our family, our environment, every day that we have more experience. I would argue you are more valuable the last day on earth than you were the first day on earth. But only if you share it. Only if you take that opportunity to share that perspective, to share that wisdom. Right? In Colossians, right, how do we share that perspective? So if we take the Army leadership model development framework, and we think about that to our faith walk, what are the domains that we exist in, that we live in? Well, again, first of all, I would argue the world we live in. And that can be as small as your family, your community, your neighborhood, but could be as wide as the whole world. Right? That's your profession, your social circles, your social media. Don't underestimate that opportunity to influence, to share perspective. The second one is this wonderful and amazing thing we call fellowship. Right? This church, any church that teaches the good news of Jesus Christ. Our small groups. Right? Those opportunities that we have to develop our knowledge, right? That institutional knowledge about who Jesus is and what this faith walk is all about. And the last one, and the most important one to me, is our prayer life. Right? This is our self-development. What's your plan? Do you have a plan? Do you have an individual prayer plan? Just like I have an individual development plan? Have you structured your prayer life the way that you structure other aspects of your life? And I'm asking myself these same questions that I'm asking you, because I don't get this right. But I think about this every day. So, the world we live in. I had one of the gentlemen that's in my Monday night men's group was listening to me talk about how I thought the world was going you-know-where in a handbasket. And he politely reminded me, he's like, didn't you study history at that fancy Army War College thing you went to? Yeah. Don't you remember what you talked about, that we've always competed, that we've always been a fallen world? And he's right. It was my own arrogance, my own hubris, to think that my experiences right now are more important than somebody who lived before me. The world's always been messed up. We live in a fallen, sinful world. But our perspective, influenced by our faith, wisdom, and experience, changes. So this quote up here by Bob Golf, who's the BG you see at the bottom there, right, is a great summation for me of how do you look at the world? How do you look at everyday situations? I already told you, right, this week has been a challenging one for me for a couple different reasons. But then I thought about this slide right here, this message, and I'm like, it's no big deal. It is no big deal. Now, there's probably a man in this room who's not familiar with this verse. But what does it mean to you? Right? It's one of those verses that gets popularized and used frequently. But what does it mean to you? What does it mean to your small group? I'd invite you to have that conversation afterwards of what does it mean to sharpen? What does it mean to be iron or steel, depending on your translation? And how do you serve each other in this capacity? Because as popular as this phrase is, I would argue it's one of the most challenging things we'll do. It requires a level of trust, vulnerability, and if you're the one doing the sharpening, or if you're the one being sharpened, it takes perspective to know that that's happening and not respond out of our natural instinct to retaliate, to attack, to compete. So what do you pray for? So I've found, as I've continued through my faith walk, my prayer life has really become focused on wisdom. There are a lot of needs in this world. There's a lot of darkness. There's a lot of opportunity to share God's word, share his good news, his peace. So I pray for wisdom. Whether it's wisdom for myself to understand the situation and what actions I should take as a Christian. Wisdom for others that they may be able to see, to navigate, to understand the situation that they're in. Whatever the issue is, no matter how big, no matter how small. Wisdom provides you that understanding. It provides you that perspective. Right? Many of us are familiar, right, with King Solomon. Right? And again, I didn't go to seminary, so somebody can fact check me on this, right? But it's the only time I know in the Bible, right, where God came down to man and said, hey, what do you want? I'll give you one wish. He's already the most powerful guy in the world, right? He's got everything he needs from a worldly perspective. So what did he ask for? Wisdom. Discernment. The ability to understand God's will. Not our will. Not our plan. What did God say? What did God want? And it's hard. I'll just speak for myself. It's hard to always hear that wisdom. We are so easily distracted. I would argue we practice distraction. Right? So have a plan. Write it down. Share it with another. Figure out, what does that look like? How do I develop myself? But don't get caught in that, well, it's just I need to develop my attributes, right? I need to develop I need to go deeper. I need to understand the Bible better. Yeah, absolutely. But remember that it's those three domains, right? And they all operating in together. Don't forget about the world we live in. Don't forget about your own prayer life. Right? All those things are important. That fellowship, that sharpening, that understanding, all those things matter. And be intentional. I'll admit it's easy in the Army. Right? This stuff is all laid out. You do this, and then you do this, and then you go here, and then you come there, and then it all works. But it only works if you work it. If you put in the time, you put in the energy, you put in the effort. And I would argue that God has that laid out for us too. He provides us the purpose, direction, and motivation. We just have to be intentional about finding it and executing on it. So I'll leave you with a couple questions. So of those domains, which one are you most comfortable in? Is your prayer life on fire? Some of these, is your men's group your source of peace and camaraderie? It's the world we live in. Whether you define that as people that I interact with every day or the world at large. And where are you least comfortable? What's the areas that you could use some focus, some perspective? And the last thing is, where do I seek wisdom? Who do I consider to be wise? Whose advice do you seek? Who do you trust? How do you discern? I would hope that all of us have somebody in our lives that can help us walk through these. Again, whatever it is. If not, I'm sure that any one of us here would be happy to help. Because the important thing is we don't do this alone. Leadership development's a team sport. It takes an army, literally. The world we live in is very challenging. So don't do it alone. Thank you.